Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, and welcome to the Karey Carbaugh podcast, episode number 56. Buenas noches, damas y caballeros, chicos y chicas, niños de todas edades, y bienvenidos a el Karey Carbaugh podcast, episodio número 56. Welcome. My name is Karey Carbaugh, and this is the Karey Carbaugh podcast. We're a little bit later than usual tonight. As I've mentioned before, I may be shifting this podcast a little bit later, or we may look at a different night. I've got a few things that are changing here in the new year, and I'll explain a little bit more about that as things become more settled. So, all part of Seeking My Purpose, which is the title of tonight's podcast. Seeking Your God-Given Purpose. And actually, I think I titled it How to Seek Your God-Given Purpose. And we will get into that here in a moment. I want to share a story through Scripture that was shared with our congregation this past week. And I'm not going to read it, but I'm going to give you kind of a summary. It's fairly long, and then I'm going to give you also the reference for the passage. But before we get into that, if you would, let me know whether you're watching this live or on the replay by dropping the word live or replay, or simply an L or an R in the comments. That's always helpful for me to know who's watching it live and who's catching this on the replay. And also, if you would, let me know where you're tuning in from. This is also very interesting to me as this podcast is reaching much wider than I would have ever expected. We've been doing this now for a little over a year, and I'm still refining the purpose of these podcasts, but I know that they are aimed at helping people with their self-esteem. And I believe that finding your God-given purpose is a big part of positive and uplifting self-esteem. And you'll see what I mean by that as we get into this. The last couple of weeks we've talked about vision, casting vision for your life, and setting resolutions versus setting plans. And we talked about how setting plans and having a plan is much more productive than simply a resolution, deciding I'm going to change this, and not really having a plan behind that. And I believe this really does flow nicely into tonight's topic. So let's dive in. Tonight's message or topic comes from the book of Nehemiah, chapter 2, verses 1 through 20. And as I mentioned, I'm not going to read them. I'm going to kind of summarize them. And then I encourage you to go back and read the actual passage and not just take my word for it, but really read the Word of God. But Nehemiah was a character in the Old Testament of the Bible. As I've shared before, I am a Christian. I am a believer. I don't hide that. I don't force that on anyone else, but that's who I am. And that's the perspective that I come at these podcasts with. So you may have a different philosophy, and that's okay. I hope you can take from this message what is meaningful for you and who you believe is your higher power. I do believe that Jesus Christ and God are my higher power, and I make no bones about that. But again, I don't force that on anyone. So let's dive in here and talk a little bit about Nehemiah. Who was Nehemiah in the Old Testament? Well, the Bible tells us he was actually the cupbearer for the king. And I would have thought that the cupbearer was simply someone who took the cup of wine or whatever the king was going to drink to the king. And I think this is a part of his job, but I had never really thought about the fact that the cupbearer is someone who is very close to the king, someone who is a confidant to the king. The king can confide in him and They can probably speak fairly openly because not very many people get to be in the presence of a king. We don't have kings quite in the same way that they did in the Old Testament of the Bible, but the king had a lot of power. And if he didn't like what you said, he could have you banished from the kingdom, or in some extreme cases, have you killed. And we see in Nehemiah, before we come to this passage, he's been praying for several months about something that he feels God has put on his heart, and that is to go back to Israel, the land of his fathers. He refers to it as the graveyard, or the place where his fathers are buried, his ancestors, essentially. And Israel has been destroyed, and Nehemiah's vision for his life, he believes his God-given mission, is to go back and rebuild Israel. But he needs to get permission from the king to do that. And this particular king has already said, he has put out an order that Israel is not to be rebuilt. And in particular, he said there is not to be a wall put around Israel, because he believed that Israel would then rise up against the king and would not follow the king's orders. And so Nehemiah is kind of at a crossroads here, and he prays about it. God, give me the words and give me the right timing. And so he comes into the presence of the king, and he's sad. He's upset. He's probably torn between what he knows God is calling him to do and his loyalty to his job with the king, or his current position. And he knows that he could risk all of that. The cupbearer is a fairly high-level position. And Nehemiah was a Jew. The king was not. And so even for a Jew to be in this type of position is huge. It's a major thing back in biblical times. And God has likely put Nehemiah in this position for this very, very time. And so Nehemiah walks in to the king, and the king can tell because he sees Nehemiah every day. He says, "Why are you sad? People are supposed to be happy and upbeat in the presence of the king." I'm guessing this is partly because the king doesn't want to be surrounded by negativity, but also it is such an honor to be in the presence of the king. Even if this is something you do every day, it's going to be a great honor and something to be happy about. But on this particular occasion, Nehemiah is not happy. He's sad. He's really torn. And the king actually opens the doorway for this conversation, and he says, "Nehemiah, what's making you sad?" And before Nehemiah responds, he says a little prayer. Excuse me. He says a little prayer to God. I'm guessing he didn't, kneel down and bow down and fold his hands. He just threw up a little, we call them arrow prayers. I'm guessing he probably said, "Okay, God, help me. Give me the right words to say here." Because if he says the wrong words, he knows it could cost him his job and maybe even his life. But he says to the king, he says, "I want to go back and rebuild the land of my forefathers." And the king allows him to do that. He grants him that wish. But then he also says, "How long do you need to be gone? And what do you need to complete this mission?" And before Nehemiah leaves, the king is actually giving him supplies. Nehemiah asks the king to write him a letter to each of the governors that he will be passing through the land of, so that they will allow him passage, because as a Jew, there were certain areas that Jews were not allowed to pass through. And particularly, many of the areas, if they found out he was going back to rebuild Israel, would not have been favorable to that. And so the king grants him that, and he provides him not only with the time and leave to go, but also the materials that he's going to need to rebuild it, at least the wood, the trees and the logs. And he sends him with guards to keep him safe. And as a believer, I don't believe this is any coincidence. I believe this is all God-led. It's all in God's timing. And it's to fulfill the purpose that God gave Nehemiah. And he faces some opposition as he travels. Several of the areas that he travels through, the governors stop him, or the people stop him and ask what he's doing, and does the king know that he's traveling through there? And he has these letters from the king so that he can present those to the governors and the people in the areas that he's traveling through. And he eventually arrives at Israel. We don't know if he's ever been there before, if he's ever seen the destruction, or if maybe this is the first time and he's just heard about it. But before he does anything, he walks around and he gets to know the people. He doesn't just come in and say, okay, folks, we're going to rebuild the temple. And the king was also very clear that he was given permission to rebuild the temple, but not the wall around the city. So the king has kind of gone back on his earlier decree, or his earlier command that the temple would not be rebuilt. But he's still sticking firm to his statement that you can rebuild the temple, but there will be no wall around Israel. So he's protecting his own, the king is protecting his own interests, his own power, but granting Nehemiah what Nehemiah feels that God has called him to do. And through all of his discussion with the king, he never says, God has called me to do this. He says, if it pleases the king, let me do this. And I believe this is a great model for us as well when we're approaching leadership in our lives. If this is your will, or if it's okay with you, I would like to do this, rather than just, I need to do this and this needs to happen. It's all about how we approach it. And I think Nehemiah was given that direction probably from God, that God told him this is the best way to approach the king. And so he eventually gets to Israel, and he calls upon the common people. It says he calls the normal common people to help him rebuild the temple. And he finds out what they're about, what their vision is for this as well. So he casts a shared vision, not just his own commanded vision, but he really works with the people. And I think he's modeling a lot of things here that are important for us as we seek our God-given vision and God-given mission. So as we come to a conclusion on Nehemiah's story, I will transition into talking about how do we find our God-given purpose. If you're getting value from this, if you would, drop a V or the word value in the comments. And if you find this relatable, drop the word relate in the comments. I would greatly appreciate that. And if you're liking this, smash that like button. Like if you do, share it out. Invite other people to join these podcasts, to watch them either live or on the replay here on Facebook. Or I copy them over to Instagram and YouTube. My channels there are just my name as well. So I would be grateful if you would encourage and invite other people that you think might get something from this message to watch them on any one of those three platforms. So, how do we know God's purpose for our life? I would like to suggest, in the words of Pastor Nick that were shared with our congregation this past Sunday, it's really quite simple. Read the Bible. Again, as a believer, it's that simple. Read the Bible. God casts the basic vision for your life and for my life through His Word. And I would like to suggest to you that our shared basic calling or mission, purpose, whatever word you want to put on it, is to serve God. To love God, to love His people and serve His people. It's really that simple. That is why we're sent here. That is the purpose for our lives. Now, having said that, each one of us is given different gifts. So we don't all serve Him and serve His people the same way. And that's where I believe that prayer is important. Talking to God. Again, reading the Bible. I've always felt that a calling for my life has been to work with young people, youth, children, and I've been in a bit of a dry spell the last few years and haven't had some of the opportunities that I've had through church. I'm seeking some additional opportunities for that, and I'll go into that if it comes to pass. That's part of why I may have to shift these podcasts from Wednesday night at this time. But I do believe as Christians, as believers, that if we seek His Word, if we read His Word and pray, He will show us, first of all, the basic vision for our life, to love and serve Him, to love and serve His people. But then, what gifts has He given you? Maybe you have some gifts that come to mind right away. If you feel comfortable doing so, I encourage you to drop those in the chat. Let me know what your God-given gifts or talents are. I've just shared a couple of mine with you. And as we bring this in for a close, if you would, I'd be very interested in knowing what your God-given talents are. Have you been able to use those for His good, for His glory? Are you seeking opportunities? Let me know, and maybe we can work through that together. If you would like to be added to my email list so that I can invite you to some private events where we can dive a little deeper into some of this, drop the word email in the chat, and then I will reach out to you and get your email address. I have a few, and I haven't forgotten you, those who've given me your email addresses a little while ago. I haven't forgotten you. We just haven't launched that part of this yet. But drop that word email or send me a direct personal message with your email address, and I will add you to my list, and we'll keep those private. I will blind carbon copy everyone so that I'm not disclosing email addresses. I will respect your privacy and would love to dive deeper into some of this with you. Seeking your God-given purpose, helping with your self-esteem, and together we can see what God has in store for you. So with that, this has been the Karey Carbaugh podcast, and this is the message I had for you tonight. I hope you've gotten value from this. Let me know if you have. And I will see you on the next episode of the Karey Carbaugh podcast if I don't pop in for a spontaneous impromptu in the meantime. Until then, make it a great day. Make it a blessed day for those people around you. Be a blessing. Do something positive. We have so much hate and disgruntlement in the world right now. Be a light, be a positive influence, and do something positive for those around you. And until next time, as I say, make it a blessed week, and we will see you soon. Thank you very much, and have a great evening. Goodbye for now.